thank you again for being here today. This is, the third year of our symposium, and each year and each panel, one of the things I want is to get you the most diverse experience of various aspects of what we do in sports communication. Last year we had some great play-by-play announcers here with John Rooney and Len Casper and John Miller and myself, and Dave handled that one, and with ESPN. Actually, it was Dave Snell who did it last year. Dave Snell has been the announcer for Bradley basketball for 39 years, which means he's only 30 years behind Vin Scully. And this morning we had a wonderful panel with media relations folks and the new media, and now the guys and women that I admire most are the writers, because they're the ones who create the ideas that we used to read first thing in the morning. Now we read the last thing at night before going to bed online. And I wanted to get a cross-section of really the best of the best in the country, and everybody I asked thankfully said yes. So I'm going to introduce them all. You have the program, so I don't have to go through their resumes. But at the far end is one of the most influential baseball writers in the country, from USA Today, Bob Nightingale. Bob's son actually went to the sports communication school before my name. So
I gave him an A.
well, there you go. And Dave, you had his son too, as a student. All right.
And I gave him an A as well.
Oh, they're just, Nightingale, they're just sucking up to you. Next is a Peoria native who has had a spectacular career up to and including Sports Illustrated. He's been in Chicago now forever. He has come home for the day to be with us, Rick Telander. And one of the things I try to do in these programs is get a cross-section of people, age, sex, all of that stuff. And for me, one of the really great young writers in the country is now the beat writer at the ripe old age of 30 for the Los Angeles Times, Andy McCullough. More than twice his age.
Thank you very much.
Is again one of the guys who is just respected throughout the industry. He has been in St. Louis. He knew Louis before he became a Saint, give or take. His nickname is the Commish. He's in the Baseball Hall of Fame for perfectly good reason. Rick Hummel. And to my immediate right, she has covered or done penance for covering the Oakland Athletics for the last 19 years, and one of the great beat writers in the country for the San Francisco Chronicle, Susan Slusser. She wanted to be here so much that she spent her wedding anniversary in Peoria last night to be here today without the hubby. Yeah! And then finally, he's going to moderate the panel again, one of the great writers in the country. And the Morton Girls High School basketball team became my favorite. And I'm so happy he is part of Bradley, part of our school, and he's as good a writer as there is as well. Dave Kindred, and y'all have a good time and be brave.
I have written about the Morton High School girls basketball team the last 7 years. The third book is available. If you want to go to MortonLadyPotters.com, you can buy all 3 books for $24. The third one will be published like next week. It's called The Unbelievables, because when the girls got to Redbird Arena this year and won again, the coach just kept walking around the floor saying, "Unbelievable, unbelievable," because they've won. Morton is the only small town public school ever to win a 3A state championship. So I've been very happy. I've done a little bit of everything from Muhammad Ali to the girls' basketball team, and I've had fun doing it because to me, story is a story. And there are just as many good stories at the high school level as there are at any level. All you have to do is what my hero Red Smith said a long time ago, just be there. Be there, pay attention. You'll see something you've never seen before. Every game you go to, you'll see something you've never seen before. Write about it. The title of this panel is The Evolution of Storytelling, and I've asked each of the panelists what that means, and none of them knows, because really storytelling is storytelling. There's no evolving. I spoke to a third grade class in Bloomington the other day. Third grade. They're 8 and 9 years old. The shirt I wore was older than anybody else in the room. I asked them, I said, I'm supposed to talk about being a reporter. I said, anybody in this room, there are 25 little kids, classrooms are not what they were when I was a little kid. Now everybody was sitting like on bean bags or, on a sofa or on the floor on rugs. And I said, anybody here know what the 5 W's are? And a little girl right in front of me started saying, who, what, why? And she knew what the 5 W's were at 8 years old. So I don't think the idea of stories is ever going to change. We know what they are. You know a story when you hear it. They're the basic, probably the biggest change in my time as a sports writer is that, first of all, these 5 people, I asked them all, have 179 years of experience. I think Rick Hummel has most of those.
Define most.
But my time, I grew up in Lincoln, Illinois, at my grandmother's home. Every summer, every Sunday, I would go to the train station to get the Chicago newspapers. And what I remember reading in the Chicago Tribune was the Sunday paper was what I later would learn was called the Bulldog edition, its early edition, play-by-play of Illinois football games. And when I say play-by-play, I mean play-by-play. It began, Charles Bartlett I'd read him all the time. He was a famous Chicago Tribune writer. The first line would always be Illinois 6, Michigan 0. The next sentence would be Illinois won the toss, chose to receive. And then it would be literal play-by-play. Game stories evolved into play-by-play, from play-by-play to stories about the game, and have evolved today to where game stories are don't matter. Now we're much more into analysis and opinion, background stuff than game stories. But I want to talk, these people I want to have talk. I want to encourage everybody to ask questions, first of all. The more questions we have, the better that we will like it, because we can go then to almost anything. So who has a question? Let's just start with questions. And say them loudly.
Hi, my name is Kayla Martin. I am part of the Survey 101, Com 101 class, and I'm an advertising major. But I wanted to ask, what inspired you to do what you do?
I'm sorry,
What inspired us to do what we do?
who wants to answer? Bob, you start.
Well, I love sports. As a kid and grew up, my dad was in the Air Force, so we moved every 3-4 years, but I just love sports in general. Not so much baseball, but just sports. And so I went to Arizona State, majored in journalism, and just passionate about sports. Covered all the different ones, and then went to Kansas City to cover baseball. But it's not so much that I love the baseball, but just I love the people. And so I just love being around people and talking to them and getting them to share their stories.
Was the question what inspired us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Well, for me, I'm next. I'm
Yeah,
next.
yeah.
Okay. Growing up in Peoria, my apartment was like 3 blocks from here on St. James. Just looked at it today for the first time in many years, and it's a squatty little thing. We only had the top floor. But one thing we always had in the house were books. And I had an older sister who read all the time, was very, very literate, even as kind of like a prodigy. I thought she was crazy half the time, but she'd have all these books around, and I would read them when I could. And I remember reading a book about a snake. It was called Slim Green, I think, and I was like 7. And it was just, I love snakes. I loved animals, toads, frogs. I collected them all, much to my mother's chagrin. But anyway, this story about this snake was written for like 7, 8 years old kids. And it inspired me in a way. It was like, for the first time in my life, I saw, these symbols, that's what letters are. They're just symbols. And then they create words, and those words become sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and books. And this was not a detailed book. It had very short sentences and, great pictures of this snake that I loved. And, but something went off my head. It's like, Rick, you are learning how to write yourself. They're teaching you this in school, in 2nd grade. Is there some connection maybe between this, and could you someday maybe yourself write something like about a snake, because you like snakes? And that's where it all started. I mean, it wasn't about sports. I love sports. I played sports. I would never stop playing. If somebody had a good game to play right now and I could, my knees would hold up, I'd go out and play it right this second. But it was the writing that got me going, and the idea that you can use the English language, which I believe has more words than any other language. There have been many writers who have flipped from their native tongue, maybe whether it's Polish or whatever, to write in English because the palette is so vast. That's what I saw. That's what got me into it. And writing about sports, because I love sports, it was a way to utilize words in the English language. I could have written maybe about music or something else, but I love sports, and that was, probably a lot of us felt the same way. But words were the thing that got me going.
Yeah, I did not get into Georgetown, so I went to a different college and didn't become a lawyer. So I guess that's how I. No, I mean, I think I'm pretty similar to Rick. I mean, it wasn't until I went to Syracuse, and it wasn't until I got there and sort of put 2 and 2 together that I was spending all my time, reading books like Friday Night Lights and Season on the Brink and The Fight by Norman Mailer, and I realized I could actually do this. I could, this is actually a career I could have. And so it wasn't until I got to college and sort of started working at the paper that it kind of synced up the things I was really interested in with an actual career. So it was always about, when I was a kid, I was always reading pretty compulsively, and I just kind of figured, it took me a while. I don't know why it took so long, but to put 2 and 2 together with that.
Well, I wanted to be a sports broadcaster like the great Charlie Steiner, and I grew up in Quincy, Illinois, and my driver's training instructor was named Melvin Tappy, who was a longtime great Quincy athlete. His brother, Elvin Tappy, was actually managing the Cubs at that time in the rotating college of coaches that they had. And they also broadcast the high school and the college games for Quincy High, Quincy College. And we're driving around one day. He's got his foot on the other brake, of course, in case I did something stupid. But he said, what you ought to do, this is 1962, you ought to go into sports writing because all the sportscasting jobs are going to go to ex-athletes. This is 55 years ago he said this, and he was, of course, right, but to a large extent. So I filed that away. I got out of high school, went to Quincy College, and I did, my first year there, I did a weekly radio show, sports radio show, and wrote for the college newspaper. That's going along pretty well. There was one hitch, though. I didn't know how to type. So they had typewriters in, Olivetti's, Underwood's, stuff like that. And so I wrote them out longhand, and my mother, who was a professional typist, would type them up for me, and I'd cart them back over to the school. And this went okay for a year, but I'm thinking, if I want to continue in this line of work, I'm going to have to learn how to type, because I'm not sure Mom can make all the games. So I finished typing class the next year, went to Mizzou, went in the Army, and then went to St. Louis, and 47 years later, I'm still there.
I'm a little bit like Bob in that I grew up in a military family, and I'm also an only child. So when you move from place to place, I quickly learned that the easiest way to meet people and talk to people is sports. Like people in whatever town care about the local teams, and it's an easy way to make friends. But also as an only child, my parents, at some point when I was very small, there were only 4 channels back then, to date myself, they decided I could only watch PBS and sports. So I watched a lot of sports because my other choice was like Firing Line or Masterpiece Theater. So I blamed them for winding up with a sports writer rather than a lawyer. That was all on them. But I wanted to be a sportscaster because we finally settled in the Bay Area right when the A's won 3 World Series in a row, and I wanted to be a sportscaster. So I did broadcasting all the way through college and also worked at the college paper. But I did football broadcast, baseball, all the way through. But coming out of college in 1988, they were not hiring women to do any of those jobs. So my first offer was at the Sacramento Bee newspaper, and I just stayed, which has worked out pretty well. So that's all right.
So a fellow asked me today when I decided I wanted to be a sports writer, and I decided when I was 15, actually I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, although when I was 17, my father, who was 49, challenged me to a race to first base, and he won, and I decided that maybe I wasn't as fast as I thought I was, which was an interesting sports writing lesson because I thought I was very fast. So anytime any player tells me how good they are, I divide it by like 10 because I know what I did when I was 17. So then I wanted to be a Major League Baseball writer. I wanted to be these guys until I saw how hard they worked and how much they had to do. Then I decided I want to be a columnist because then I just make friends with these guys and they tell me everything and then it makes my job easier.
He got it down, didn't he?
So anyway, I was 15. My mother bought me a typewriter. I took typing class in high school, by the way. I was the only guy in the class, so there was that advantage too. But my mother bought me a typewriter when I was 15. And I sat at the kitchen table, and I remember this, and it was a long time ago, but I remember this. I sat there until I decided what I was going to write that I would remember as the first words I ever typed. And the first words I ever typed were Stanley Frank Musial.
Wow.
So from then on, all I wanted to do was be a sports writer. And I could not be on television or radio. I was afraid to talk. I've now talked more in the last 5 minutes than I talked in the first 15 years of my life. I was too shy to talk. I took 4 years of Spanish in college and never could read it and write it, could never speak it or understand it. Did a 5-minute speech one time that I actually said about 6 words. So I wanted to be a writer. And my advice to everybody always has been to read everything and write all the time. Doesn't have to be sports, doesn't have to be just read everything all the time and write all the time. Another question? Yes, sir.
So I have a question for Mr. Nightingale. You're one of the most well-established baseball writers in America, and I was wondering, do you have any huge obstacles that you had to overcome in order to get to where you're at right now?
Like Dave was saying, I was painfully shy. My dad was Colonel in the Air Force. It was like you don't speak unless spoken to. So it kind of got me out of my shell. And I still get nervous sometimes going to a strange clubhouse because I'm not a beat writer anymore, like Andy and Susan and Rick are. And so just get to know people by just talking to them with your notebook closed, your tape recorder off. And then it becomes easier because then people start to trust you and talk with you. And I notice now you don't see that as much anymore where everybody just puts a microphone in someone's face without getting to know the person before.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for Rick. Rick, you've written books, Sports Illustrated, and now a column in the Sun-Times. Do you have a preference, and what's the difference for you in writing styles amongst those three?
Well, I never thought that I would be a columnist, ever. I'd never dreamed that. And to bring up the concept of typing, which none of you have to deal with, you young people, thank God. But if you couldn't type, that's why I didn't go right into journalism right away. First book I wrote, Heaven is a Playground, it was 600 pages of yellow legal pad. I wrote it in pencil because I literally couldn't type. And when you typed, you had to, if you made a mistake, you had to put whiteout on there and all that stuff. So the laptop freed me up for a lot of things that I never thought I could do. Made writing easy because there are still guys in the press box. Maybe some of you have seen him. I don't know who it is. He types with one finger on a laptop, literally. Do you know that guy?
Bruce Jenkins does, doesn't he?
Bruce does, yeah,
I
TR
think
does.
Bruce does,
TR
yeah.
does.
There was a guy at the
one
West-
finger.
yeah.
You can do it. He's fast. You know, it's like, eh. So doing a column, I've kind of decided, you know, the length is going to be the same all the time. You pretty much, it was a little longer when I first started, like 800, maybe a little over 800 words. We're down to maybe 650 now, you know. And I call it like, say hello, do a somersault, and say goodbye. You know, you got to have those little things there. And when you write a longer piece, like for Sports Illustrated, I wrote for ESPN, the magazine, for a few years. You know, it's almost like writing a book in that you have to have, you got to just hang around and you got to let the story form. And that's the most terrifying part is you don't know what the story is going to be. You got to get, as Bob was saying, you got to get close to people. You got to become friends with them. If you're writing a profile of somebody, nobody wants to hang around with a guy that they just think is a complete ass or is, you know, not fun to be with or just makes them uptight. So you got to do that, and then you have to think, okay, where does this start? Where's the middle? I mean, what's the, you know, the crux of it? What's the crisis, if there is one? Everybody's got things that have gone wrong in their life. Where was the moment where they had to transcend something? It's like a mini book if you're writing, say, 3,000 words. And some of the stories I wrote, you know, would be as long as 8,000 words. So those are now called long form. If you're going to do that for a magazine or whatever, it used to just be called magazine pieces. They're very different. And, you know, as a columnist, you have to have an opinion, and you need it to be a real opinion. You can't make up an opinion. That's bad when people do that. You can tell they're just doing it to create some havoc, or, you know, they're rolling a bomb into the thing. Let's see what happens. That's wrong. If you should have something you really believe. And there's so many topics out there, like Colin Kaepernick. That story's had legs for so long. And if you're going to write about it how you really actually feel. Do investigation about it if you're going to write a column. Don't just do a knee-jerk thing like, you know, get rid of him, or he's the savior of the world. You know, think about it. So having done both, I haven't written a longer piece in a while, and I'm wondering if, you know, how my brain would respond to that. And one thing I've always done, and I suggest to everybody, even if you're just doing it for TV or you're doing, you know, a radio piece, an outline. You know, you learn that in 5th grade or whatever. Some kind of outline. It can be the simplest thing in the world. Just, it can be like 4 things. A, B, C, D. I'll still use a Roman numeral and go down, because you can't remember. You can't hold it all in your head. You think, what was I going to say? What was I going to do? But once you have it down on paper, it makes it much easier. That's just one tip that has always worked for me.
In however long I've been doing this, I've never written anything without doing what Rick is talking about, just making notes. First of all, I make the notes, I number the notes, I index the notes, I write key words from the notes. Then when I'm writing, when I'm done, I look at the notes again, I mark some notes, this must be in the piece. If that's not in the piece, I find a way to get it in. And because too many times early on, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and realize I left out the best part of the column. I wanted to make sure that that never happened again. So I made notes to myself during the process. It was like, by the time I finished doing a column, and I'm talking about 800 words, 900 words, I would have read every note 7 different times, from listening to it, to writing it down, to indexing it, to looking at it again, to writing, then reviewing it, and just to make sure that I had it all in there. Because there's nothing worse, or at least there was for me, than waking up at 2 in the morning and realizing that you left out the best quote. So it became a technique that I've used for 45 years. I learned it from a guy at the Louisville Courier-Journal in 1972. Yes, sir.
Were there any times where, like,
Does today count?
Go for it. You got the floor now. Yeah.
No, I mean, like, I think if you're not wrestling with doubt, maybe not about like the security of your like job but like if you think at all times that that you're the best writer in the world, or you worked as hard as possible on a story, or if you're not checking yourself, I think at all times you're going to fall behind. I think you need to, you can't really rest on your laurels in terms of like what Susan and I do is we work the clubhouse, so we talk to the 25 guys on the roster on a daily basis, but you can't ever feel like, oh, I know exactly what everyone in this room feels at all times. You have to always be, that's kind of the nature of reporting, is that it never ends. So, in terms of job security, I feel fine right now, but we'll see how tomorrow goes, I guess, at Trunk. I think it's just important to always be vigilant, I guess, in terms of never feeling satisfied with what you're doing.
One thing that I've thought about that, I've lost six-figure jobs before. It's no fun. But if you're in this business to make money, you're in the wrong business. This is a follow your passion kind of business. If you make money, that's a bonus. Almost literally. I actually said this to an editor who later decided that he needed to trim his payroll, and I was one of the trims. But I actually said to him once, I would do this job for nothing. He later took me up on that, so don't ever say that.
I was going to say.
But it's true. I was 35 years old before I ever thought about how much money I was making. So the money never mattered. I don't know about anybody else here, but I was happy doing what I was doing, and was blessed to be doing it. Getting paid for doing something that most people pay to go see. Yes, sir.
Except for Andy, all of you go back to the day when you had a deadline, you had to file it, you didn't see the paper until the next morning. How has your world changed now that the article is appearing an hour after the game's over? How does that affect how you cover the game?
I'll take this. It's 24/7 now. It's kind of almost being like on call all the time. The old days were great because, especially as a beat writer, what you want is to be out in front of the news and be the first person, scoop everybody. So if you scooped everybody, it was in your paper the next morning and in nobody else's, and everybody knew it. Now you post your scoop on Twitter, your competition ideally at least calls and confirms it, and then 5 minutes later they say, I've confirmed it, or in some cases they'll just say, yes, I've learned that too. And your scoop is basically gone. Most people don't know or care where that news came from in the first place, so that's hurt us a little bit. In terms of deadlines, a lot of publications are very different in how they think about that. I'm lucky to work for a newspaper that still cares about the newspaper first, and so we do actually have deadlines that we're pretty concerned about to file for the paper. But like everybody, we file an internet story the second the game's done, and immediately for news. But we still, somebody was saying that at their newspaper that some writers don't even know when the newspaper deadline is because they're all focused just on filing for the internet. We're not. We're newspaper first.
Andy, talk about that a little bit, because I'm
Sure.
not familiar with those deadlines anymore.
What, like the internet, or?
Well, do you have a newspaper deadline?
Yes, yeah, we do. So.
Is it before the game is over?
No.
We're West Coast papers.
So West Coast papers, I spent the first 5 years of my career in New York, and they have these things called earlies, which are miserable. Basically, the idea of an early is that the game starts at 7 o'clock for your first edition. The game will not end by the time the first edition copy is due, so you'd have to write something called an early, and it just, it's one of the problems with newspapers is that they have these stories that are basically useless and why people would pay money. Anyway, newspapers are great. So we don't have that on the West Coast, but we do have basically like, the way it's been at the Times is always, I file running as soon as the game ends, and then usually I have until about 10:40 to hit the first edition. Sometimes the gap between when the game ends and 10:40 is pretty tight, so I like to have my running just be able to stand for the first edition, and then we'll have till 10:40 and maybe 11:10, and then you can come back if you want to write for the web after that. I usually don't because I find it to be just a bit of a headache to be going into the story 4 times and fixing it up. But we have pretty hard deadlines, I guess, on a nightly basis.
You know, the hard part about this, probably the hardest part for me is when you're doing internet and paper stuff at the same time, for games in the Midwest or even back east, it's awfully hard to watch the game. You're watching how fast you can get up on the internet. You would like to just sit there and watch the pitches, watch the fielders, watch the hitters, whatever, but you got other responsibilities, and it's not quite the same.
Yeah, that's the part that I've never quite got my mind around, is the fact that you may have to tweet during the game, you may have to do running during the game.
You will have to do running during the
Yeah, and you've got people who think they're like the press box wags, cracking jokes and interrupting you.
Andy.
I don't know. I used to work with a guy who every time I would make a wisecrack, he would say, "You shouldn't have said that," because it would wind up in his column. And he was right. I shouldn't have said that. But that's always been a mystery to me, is how, like I said, I wanted to be a baseball writer until I saw actually what their job was. Because I like to go to the game. I like to know what happened in the game. And when you're writing all the time, keeping score, it's like, I could do that from home. Almost do it from home. I could cover a Super Bowl from home. Because you can see the interviews on television. You can get the printouts. You can do everything at home that you do at the game, except buy a $1,500 ticket for your wife. Andy, tell us about one of the things that Andy does too. This is 21st century stuff. Is you kind of a video with a partner of his. It's not Abbott and Costello, but it's close.
More or less.
Yeah. Cheech and Chong. I think Charlie described it as Cheech and Chong of baseball TV.
Cheech?
So tell us how that works.
Yeah, I think
This is after you're done with all your newspaper or internet stuff.
They, we're trying to, as much as we can, to do video, and I think, obviously we're never going to be as good at it as television networks, but we had a dedicated videographer with us throughout the postseason this year who would shoot interviews post-game with the players and stuff, and then they would have myself and Dylan Hernandez, one of our columnists, do kind of a 5 to 10 minute stand-up video. And I guess I don't know how this should make me feel about the future of journalism, but they're very popular, and more popular than the stuff we write, apparently. But people seem to really like it, and we tried to be relatively irreverent during the videos and have fun with it. And but it's people want something outside of just the written word, which is fine. I would prefer it to be the other way, but it's not too labor intensive, and people seem to really respond to it, I guess.
I like the idea that it's lightly produced, I think, as you said.
It's definitely not well produced.
Because I do think, I also like podcasts. I don't like 39-minute podcasts, but I'd like to listen to somebody for 15 minutes talk about the game afterwards. I think that and the more tools that you can master, all I ever wanted to do, all I ever needed to do is like Rick, learn how to type. That's all I needed to do. But now I think if you want to be in this business, you need to we were talking earlier today about be a 5-tool journalist. Learn everything. Learn how to do video, learn how to do audio, learn how to mix it, do everything. Because you never know in this business. There's more opportunities today than there were certainly when I was a kid. When I was a kid, you worked for a newspaper, newspaper or television. The television had been invented when I was a kid, just barely, but it was not an option for me. But today there are all sorts of options from, teams. Teams hire good journalists now. The more responsible teams do. A lot of opportunities, but just have to master all the tools.
This is for Andy, Rick, and Susan. You cover the same team for 162 games in spring training, and at least for Andy, the playoffs. How do you go about
Bang, bang.
how do you go about trying to find new ways to tell compelling stories about the same players every day? You know, like how you read about Clayton Kershaw's awesome, or Mike Matheny brought in the wrong reliever, or Stooge in the dugout game.
Well, I covered a last place team, so for 3 years. That can be a little challenging. But one of the good things about baseball is, as you mentioned, every day is completely different. Every game you see something different. And with a last place team, you almost have more leeway because you don't really need to write about the games by the end of the season, especially the games really don't matter. So you can make them more, profiles or analysis or looks ahead. And baseball is like the season itself is a story. So you can kind of write about trends. It's really, you've got so many different options with baseball. I covered the NBA for a couple of years too. It's completely different. You are not afforded. The games themselves tend to be more difficult to write really because they're either blowouts or decided in the last couple of minutes. So the stories wind up being a little samey. And there's so many days off, that's when you write profiles and trend pieces and things like that. You can't really do it as much as the game. So baseball, for me, we talk about kind of like the art of storytelling. Baseball is the perfect sport, I think, for storytelling in that way.
Well, I've been lucky to have worked in St. Louis as long as I have to get to cover teams managed by Shane Dietz, Herzog, Torrey, La Russa. You could learn a lot from them about how they handle people, how they run games, and try to impart that to the readers as best you can. And the St. Louis fan base is probably as intelligent as anybody's in the country, so they can tell when your team's not very good. Like the last couple of years, there have been a few anxious, more than a few anxious fans in St. Louis, and you have to try to answer their questions because they have many of them. Why did he do this? Why did he do that? And given that they've been in the playoffs, 10 out of 12 years or something before the last 2 years, you have to sit back and take a good hard look at why this didn't happen. And I always tend to come down on the players rather than the manager. The management brings the players, the manager manages what he has, and the players are the ones paid a lot of money to play. So in the long run, they're the ones who are not performing. The other ones, their performance is not as material as the ones on the field. So that's what you try to concentrate on is let's not blame the manager for pitching changes made or not made. Let's blame the pitcher who came in and didn't get the guy out.
Earl Weaver always said that his primary job as the manager was to pick the roster. Once he had the roster, once he had the 25 guys he wanted, it was up to them.
It's time for smoke then, right?
It's the Joe Madden theory of managing. I try to focus kind of on individuals. Like I think those are the stories that I tend to like doing, and so you're around these guys every day, so you notice things about them that other people wouldn't notice, and sometimes it's just like a stray conversation you have, or you're collecting threads. So like this year, for example, I noticed that Corey Seager, the Dodgers star shortstop, wasn't always in the best of moods, and he's normally a genial young man, but seemed like he was relatively irritated a lot of the time. And it wasn't until later in the season that he kind of opened up and explained that he'd been, fighting with the team on a daily basis about his work rate and how much he was allowed to swing and all these sort of stuff. And so if you pay attention to the little things, they eventually lead you somewhere interesting, I've found. I did a story last year on how strange Clayton Kershaw's interviews are, in that he can be very clipped, and there are certain things he really struggles to talk about, and there are certain things he really likes talking about. And so I kind of wrote about that as kind of an insight into his personality, and sort of putting his postseason stuff in context. And so I think it's just trying to find new ways to, I think it was Dan Wetzel from Yahoo once said, the job is writing about people on television, but explaining stuff about them that you can't see on television. And we have access to that on a daily basis, more or less, and you need to take advantage of it.
Yes, sir.
So because our culture has turned a lot more into like headlines and Twitter, like only 140 characters, and people won't read past the first couple paragraphs of a story very often, how does that change the way you have to tailor the stories you write, and how does that alter like the quality of what you write?
You know, one of the hard parts about that is the way newspapers are laid out these days. Now, you might only see 140 words of your own story on their front page, you know, and you better make sure the score is one of those 140 words. So you got to make sure you get your score in as high as you can, because they try to get a bunch of big graphics on a front page and then as many stories as they can, whether it's hockey or basketball or football. We don't have football, so it's hockey or baseball. And then you have to make sure some of the pertinent details are near the top of the story. You can't get too carried away with your flowery writing, because it's going to be on the jump page somewhere, and you don't know if the fan's going to jump to that or not.
Well, it seems because the Twitter and social media, they do want controversial stuff up high. And so last year I did a story with Adam Jones, why, in the Colin Kaepernick, why doesn't anybody do that in baseball? So we sat down for a half hour one night in Detroit, and then one of his quotes was because baseball is a white man's sport. And all everybody remembers from that story is that one quote, and they want that high up in the story, more normally, maybe middle of the story or so. But that's all people remember was that one sentence.
Yeah, I want to weigh in on this. All this stuff's making me think about a lot of our business. In a lot of ways, we have no idea what we're doing right now, and that's the flux. This is the internet. It has changed everything. This is like the Gutenberg press. This thing is so big and so vast. This little thing right here has more power than the computers that launched ships to the moon, and we all know that. That's redundant to go on and talk about it. But the power of this thing has changed, I think, what words are. We're getting closer and closer to almost a nonverbal or non-language form of communication. We've got emojis now that are limited by, I guess, by Google or whoever controls it. They will not allow certain emojis on there. But if they did, you might be able to communicate completely in symbols. You look at the symbols on bathroom doors, on highways if you're in a foreign country. They're not in any language that we know. I'm a sports columnist. Sports columnists have been around for over 100 years. But do we need them anymore? Bob's talking about they'll take that one quote and put it up there. With the internet and with tweeting and all the rest of this, as our president has shown, it's immediate and can be completely crazy. And what we found, it's better to be first and wrong than to be second and right. People talk about views, hits. You get 1 million of these things, and it's like we've got fake news, we've got Breitbart, we've got all this stuff out there, this clutter, this vast array of words. What do people want to see? What are they going to pay to see? Are they going to pay to? I'm reading the Peoria Journal-Star, because it's my hometown paper from back in the day, and the Wall Street Journal was there at the hotel. I like holding a paper, but I'm a dinosaur. That's over. I know it. They're not going to do that. My daughter, I talked to her, I have 4 kids. My oldest one said, "Lauren, you never read a newspaper?" And she said, "Yeah, I don't like to get that ink on my fingers." Ever. She never read a paper because of that reason, okay? So there are other things that are going on here. The video that Andy's talking about, if you have the skill of being able to produce your own music, that's a great journalism skill. Put it to your video. In the press box, I know Dave was talking about people being wiseacres, but there used to be a lot of communication and smart aleck stuff, and I kind of enjoyed it. Now nobody does, because everybody's like this. Everybody is typing every second of the game, and as Susan said, it's 24/7. If you want to stay up all night, there's tweets coming in from athletes, and you better be on their Twitter account, because they may say something. Where does it end? Where does it start? What do we want? And I think you should see that being out there. This is essentially a TV station, too. I can take videos every bit as good as somebody else. I can put words to it. I can edit it. I can put music to it. I can put original music to it. I played in a band for 46 years. That's why I'm half deaf. Serious. But anyway, you can do that stuff. You can go to archives and put photos in there. You can do your own stories. I'm such a dinosaur that I told this sometimes I won't do it, but Rick Morrissey, my fellow columnist, he lays out his whole column. The headline, the photos, the subhead, everything. What's an editor do anymore? We have contracted from about 400 people down to about 70. And the ability to do everything is now there. And if you think outside the box, there are all kinds of opportunities. But to think that somebody walking around with a gigantic television camera, if that's going to last 10 more years, when somebody can have something this small and this simple and this profound, the citizen journalist, that's also who we're competing with. So to me, I've never felt more kind of up in the air. And going back to the question I think you asked over there about security, I always question my ability to write every day of my life, and I question how I got this job, and it's, like, how did anything happen in life? And all of a sudden here I am, kind of an old guy, it's like, damn, what happened? And it's even more of that now. 10 years from now, you're going to look back on this and say, remember those simple little iPhones we had? And now it's all virtual reality or augmented reality or this, that, or the other thing. Those things are coming. They're going to be here. And rather than being just terrified of them, as I am sometimes, it's good to look at that as an opportunity. So, that's my little pep talk, because we're all here because we love what we do. And we believe in communicating in some form. And I assume that's why you're all here listening.
Andy said an interesting thing at lunch about one of the problems of communicating with athletes in the locker room today. Talk about that a little bit, Andy.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to rag on millennials for a while. Getting sold out here. Yeah, I mean, I've just noticed that a lot of younger folks, especially athletes, struggle sometimes to have one-on-one conversations. I think because so much communication is done through phones, through computers, through texting and stuff like that. And so it's been one of the challenges for me I'm 30 now, and my first year on the beat I was 22, and I really connected with the younger guys. And now when I try and talk to the 22-year-old guys, they just look at me like I have like 4 heads. It's mostly because I put on weight, but I think it's just been interesting trying to sort of break through to people who aren't used to having regular like one-on-one conversations in the way that I feel like I did growing up. I could be wrong about that, but that's been something that's been really noticeable to me, is like the younger players are just really, really struggle to just stand in front of you and talk.
You're right about that.
I feel better now.
Yeah, no.
Sir.
All right, I've got a question for Mr. Nightingale. As a national writer who doesn't cover any one specific team, you and other writers like you are always racing to break stories about trades, free agency, all sorts of stuff like that. And the big word there is sources. Source confirms, source says this. How do you make connections with those sources inside teams?
Just by using people skills, get to know people, and then they start to trust you. That, okay, I'll tell him something, I won't tell somebody else. Agents are a big thing now. 95% of the signings, trades are all broken by agents. Usually a general manager doesn't want to tip what's going on, but an agent will. So it's just, getting to know people. Whether it's even doing beat writer works and someone knows, something's going in the clubhouse, they'll tell, Andy or Susan, same thing with mine, where they'll tell me something just because of the relationship built.
I was lucky. I was part of the second wave of women sports writers. The first came along sort of in the early mid-'70s, and then I became a professional sports writer in the mid to late '80s. And it was a time where the newspaper industry was actually incredibly healthy, and they were looking to hire women and minorities. And that's a lot of the women who are in sports writing today are still a result of that, because everybody's has trimmed back so much. The opportunities are not what they used to be. So it actually probably helped me in that regard. And players had become accustomed already to having women cover them, certainly at the college level and at the pro level. So I never really had any problem with the players I had problems with were the players who gave everybody problems. But the places that I did run into maybe some gender issues were the newspapers themselves. I worked at my first job out of college. I really wanted to be a baseball beat writer. That's all I really wanted to do ever. And after 4 years of kind of waiting and being the backup baseball writer forever, I said, and they had a baseball beat writer who desperately wanted off the beat, and we kept saying, why don't you just make the switch? And my boss said, we think you're too delicate to travel all the time. I'm like, well, what? There's no difference between us. I was like, I'm younger than he is. That should be. We couldn't convince him. And then I'm not going to name the paper, but I got hired to cover a baseball team elsewhere, and they had not had any women beat writers at all. And my first day on the job, the very legendary sports editor who had hired me yelled across the newsroom when I walked in on my first day, "My golf pro wants to know what I'm doing, hiring a woman to cover baseball." And I was like, hi, everybody. I'm the one with the wrong chromosome. So, and that's it. Besides that, I mean, the people in the sport, and actually the coaches, managers, players have universally been phenomenal. So, yeah, that's really it.
Sir.
So as you guys as writers, how do you balance the questions your readers want answers, just like kind of the gossip, the popular things that gets you clicks and views, the headline writing, versus the questions that you want to answer as a writer, getting across what happened in the game, the thing that's happening in between the lines that is interesting to you as writers and curious?
I mean, I think you have to do both. It's one of the great things about Twitter is, you get instant feedback, but you also have a pretty decent pulse for what people are going to be talking about. During Game 7 of the World Series a couple days ago, you could sort of see it happening. It's like a virus spreading. People asking why Clayton Kershaw didn't start Game 7, which, I mean, it's an asinine thought for him to start Game 7, but you just see it slowly, people just tweeting at you about it, and you sort of see it spread, and so you have to figure out, okay, well, that's a question that I need to answer after the game, but there's a difference between spending 1,000 words on that versus 3 sentences, and so I think you have to find a way to balance, because a lot of times, what fans want to read is what we should be writing. I mean, that's who we service. We service the readers. We don't service ourselves. I mean, if you wanted to read 6,000 words about me staring at my navel, I wouldn't work at a newspaper. It wouldn't really work. So I think, you've seen that you have to sort of understand what the public wants, and you have to treat it fairly, and you have to explain it, but you also have to sort of get to the heart of the matter as well. So it's a balancing act.
I think when he's right, this works both ways, but I think you have to have the questions answered first that you needed to have answers for, so then you can explain to the readers what happened better. You got to know the answers yourself first. You assume the questions are going to be the same if you're watching the game, especially in a place like St. Louis where they watch everything and they know everything. And you could say they're a bunch of idiots. Well, they're not. No, they're right on most of the time. So you get the questions answered that you want to have asked yourself first, and then pass that along and make that a better product for everybody.
I think that's one place where the internet has actually helped. Because you can get in a little bubble when you cover a team specifically every day, where you kind of lose track of the big picture, and fans might not. You just kind of assume everybody knows. But if you're on Twitter, if you look at some of the fan sites and see what people are talking about, you realize not everybody is clued into all the daily stuff as much, and you might not be writing the big picture stuff. So I try to check in with what fans are interested in every now and then, just so I don't get too insular in my thinking about the team and just assuming I know what people want to know about. They don't always know everything what we do and kind of the detail that we do.
Yeah, I think there's more of a challenge certainly in baseball, I think there's more of a challenge today than there ever was, because there's so many media outlets, so many people, citizen journalists, to use that, who pay attention at levels that even people who are there every day don't pay attention. I guess I'm saying the fans know more today than they ever knew, and they ask smart questions. I mean, the first time I wrote something about, where's Paul Gullifer? I wrote something about Notre Dame football one time as if I were an expert. This was 15 years ago probably, and the internet blew up because every Notre Dame fan in the world must have a Notre Dame alert that if something bad is said, we're going to kill this guy. And so they killed me, and they were all right. And that was the worst part of it. They were all right, so that I had to go back and actually find some facts. Unlike our president, I decided I needed some facts. But I think it's more challenging today to be a sports writer, to be a sports journalist, than it ever was.
Who is or was, and this is for all six of you, who is or was your favorite sports storyteller and why? Could be a columnist, a broadcaster, author.
Yeah, mine was Jim Murray of the LA Times. I had him, the #1 guy. And when I was writing the LA Times, I would see him talk to a player for an hour on the bench, writes a story the next day, not a single quote. So one day I said, Mr. Murray, I see you talking to these players, but there's never a quote. Why is that? He says, son, if I can't write better than they talk, it's time to get out of the business. But he was a marvelous storyteller.
My heroes were kind of, more like novelists and writers of books. But when it came to storytelling, my two favorite were Frank DeFord and Dan Jenkins for Sports Illustrated, because that's where I started. And that's, Frank kind of took the tools of fiction and brought them to journalism, using kind of phrases and colloquialisms and all kinds of things you'd only see in fiction. It kind of came out of the new journalism from Tom Wolfe and all the rest of that stuff. And Dan Jenkins had that country humor that was just funny. And so those two guys are my kind of heroes.
Yeah, my answer is very cliche, but Gary Smith, the longtime do the bonus pieces for SI. He was in terms of storytelling, in terms of creativity, I think he was as good as it gets in that regard.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the writer I saw respected the most of anybody was Red Smith, the great columnist. He was in St. Louis for a while, New York, and there was a playoff series between the Dodgers and Montreal in 1981, the strike year, and they were playing for the National League Championship. And there was a off day, and the two pitchers were going to be Jerry Royce for the Dodgers in Game 3. It was series tied 1-1, and Steve Rogers of the Expos, who grew up in Springfield. And they had pitched against each other in the state tournament maybe 6-8 years before that, the state tournament. And I talked to Royce, and I talked to who I knew real well, and talked to Rogers, who I knew a little bit. And then Red Smith, who was probably in his 70s at that time, came into the Montreal clubhouse with Joe Durso, who was covering the series for the New York Times, Reds of the New York Times also. And I saw Red wanted to go over and talk to Steve Rogers about, I guess, the same topic that I had worked on. And they go over to Steve's locker, and Red extends his hand and says, Steve, it's a pleasure to meet you. And Steve Rogers is a pretty sharp guy. He says, no. It's my pleasure to meet you. And that meant a lot to me.
My baseball and really sports writing god is Roger Angell, the New Yorker. And he was not in the baseball writer, technically is not in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but we give out the Spink Award every year, which Rick here has won. And Roger Angell had never won it, and I just thought he wasn't eligible because everybody had been a member of the Baseball Writers Association, and he is not because he worked for the New Yorker, which is not a daily publication. The rule used to be BBWAA had to be daily. Even SI wasn't BBWAA for a long time. And then I found out that you didn't have to be BBWAA, so I kept trying to get the New York chapter to nominate him for the Spink Award, and they had all their own little personal kind of New York issues, so yeah, shocker. So they wouldn't. So finally I said, can the Bay Area chapter nominate him for the Spink Award? And they said, yeah, sure, why not? So we did, and he finally got in. And I remember when he got in, people kept asking me, was he your inspiration as a writer? And I I guess in a way, but you could give me a year to write a story that he'd written, and I couldn't do it. I mean, just off the chart talented in writing, describing baseball, like the little details. He could just, paint a picture like nobody else. And for anybody that's interested in great baseball writing, just look at any of his books. They're all just beautifully written. You know, it's like reading, you know, great fiction. He's like one of the great not just sports writers in American history.
I voted for Roger Angel. It was good. Red Smith was my guy. You know, I read when I was a kid. You know, I liked the fun of it. I liked the sound of his words. I liked to hear what he said. Sounded like he went to good places and did happy things. I liked DeFord too. DeFord took complex ideas and made them simple. But Red always had fun. I remember reading a No Cheering in the Press Box, an oral history of sports writers. Red said that people go to games to have fun, and they pick up the paper the next morning to have fun again. And that was always kind of my guideline on the whole job. Roger Angel was a different character, and you felt like you were at the game with him. You could feel the moment with Roger.
You know, Dave, I just want to say something about when you have a hero of great writing. I still find nuggets in almost anything I read. And it might not be the writer per se, that I'm just a fan of them, but I'm a fan of that paragraph or that sentence. And I was reading the Journal Star today, and there's an editorial about, you know, the frustration we have with gun control and all that, and with the latest thing in Texas. And this is this is just a great sentence. What's maddening is that because we can't do everything, we've chosen to do nothing. And, you know, and that's just resonated with me all day. That, like, I couldn't verbalize that, but that's where we are. We're so frustrated we don't know what to do about guns or anything, mental health, the whole bit. And I just thought, whoever wrote this, you know, my Charlie Steiner hat is tipped to them.
Yes, sir.
The six of you undeniably exhibit a long list of accomplishments, but what would you personally, if you had to pick one, would you say is the one that you were the most proud of, and why is that the one you are most proud of?
Right?
What the what?
What accomplishment you most proud of?
Huh?
What accomplishment are you most proud of?
Why me? Did you ask me?
Everybody.
Oh.
I was trying to get Bob to go first so we could go in order.
Yeah, I'd say Bob will start.
Yeah, mine is probably just a, this is going back when I was in the Arizona Republic working there. So they had a soccer team. It was actually owned by Miami Mafia. And back then, got all these documents, and I used to go in, this back old days, we went in trash cans trying to find out what was going on the soccer team and find out receipts and stuff like that. And so each week I'd go to the dumpster and find out, hey, here's some stuff, some letters that were thrown away. Nobody shredded anything. So it took about a year, and finally wrote the piece. It was an A1 story, nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. But it was just, you know, that was fun. I mean, those, it's hard to find investigation now. So I've always been a big fan of sports investigations, whether it was a fraternal thing at Penn State or what have you. But I'm a huge investigative guy.
Okay, I have, when you've written so much, I mean, like, it's just, you know, Andy's starting out here, but it's just a blizzard of words, millions of words you've written. But I remember after Hurricane Katrina, I wanted to go down there and see what was going on, and I got a little pass from our newspaper, kind of made it up to show to the cops or whatever, and I drove to Baton Rouge first. There were no hotels from Houston all the way, I mean, anywhere, if you remember back to that hurricane. And I'm in Baton Rouge, because I knew to get into New Orleans it was going to be a little tricky. I was going to go the next day, because you couldn't fly in either. You had to, I don't know where I flew into it. I drove a long ways. And I had no place to stay that night, because there's no hotels or anything. And I was on the LSU, near the campus there. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to sleep in my car. Now, this was August, I want to say. And it was 95 degrees and mosquitoes, you know, I had to have the windows open. I said, I can't do this. I tried for a while. So I went to this bar and just hung out there, had a few beers, started talking with the guys. And I said, I'd pay anybody $100 if they'd let me sleep on their floor. And this one kid said, yeah, sleeping on my floor. So I went to his place, slept on a blow-up mattress. He didn't want the money, but I gave him the money. And they had a cat was running. The cat would jump on my head in the middle of the night. You know, it was terrifying. I didn't know where I was. And he had his girlfriend, but they trusted me, so I was proud of that. And the next day I said, hey, Bud, he was a student. Do you want to go to New Orleans? He said, yeah, let's go. So the two of us went down and blew through. They had guys with, commandos. It was the National Guard was there, and they had big bunkers, and you could not get in. There was no electricity in the whole city. And it looked like, one of these apocalyptic movies. That's exactly what it looked like. And maybe you've seen that in since we've had other superstores, but it was terrifying. And anyway, I ended up in there getting all these stories that had to do with the Saints and the Superdome and all the rest of that stuff. And so I was just kind of, you feel good when you do something that somebody else wouldn't have done. And there's no big deal. Sleep on the floor, I mean, so what? Come on, get over it. But anyway, that was pretty cool. I like doing that.
For me, I guess outside of being invited by Charlie to be here today, I think like the accomplishments. I've been very lucky in the past 4 years. The team I've covered has gone to the World Series 3 times, so twice in Kansas City and this past year in Los Angeles. And I feel like in all 3 of those cases, the paper I was at, the Star, the Kansas City Star, and then the Los Angeles Times, we've done. I'm just proud of the work we've done there, and I'm proud to being a part of that team. And doing this stuff, you get a lot of sort of crank emails from readers, but you also get a lot of sincere ones. And just the amount of, the Royals hadn't been to the playoffs since 1985. The Dodgers hadn't been to the World Series since 1988, and you get emails from readers, thanking you for the coverage, thanking you for the stories you write, talking about how they're framing copies of the paper, asking people from across the country, asking if you can mail them copies because they want to have, the physical hard copy of the paper. And so, just being a part of that and feeling like as the beat writer for the newspaper, we did right by the story. For me, that's been, these past 4 years, that's been a real accomplishment to be proud of, I feel like.
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say it was being named the Spink winner, as Susan so graciously mentioned, because that award is voted on by the people up here that are sitting next to me, my peers, and that means everything to me now. Perhaps it was all the beers I bought the writers over the years at the Missouri Bar and Grill, but nonetheless, I appreciate their support.
I voted for Hummel. I didn't get a beer.
I was the first and still only woman to be the president of the Baseball Writers Association, which was really great because it's actually an election. It's a local election in your area, so it's sort of your immediate peers. But it's also, people think of the Baseball Writers Association as, the people that vote on the Hall of Fame, the postseason awards. But really, it's more of a journalist workplace organization. It's to provide adequate access and good working environment for baseball writers, which are things I really feel strongly about. And Mike Teeman from MLB is here. You will recall this the year I was president. We had a terrible issue in Anaheim where they decided to move their press box which was maybe the best press box in baseball. You could see everything. It was low. It was gorgeous. Tons of room. To this essentially a luxury box that was right down by the right field foul pole. And when you turned your laptop and looked at home plate, you actually could not see home plate because of the angle we sat in. So I helped broker sort of a compromise where we got this really, can I say crappy little press box behind home plate where we could see, but with 0 amenities. And it crams in like maybe, 10 or 11 people. And then everybody else, if they wanted to, could stay in the luxury box where they have food and all sorts of stuff. And we have basically nothing and sort of bare wood benches. But if you want to see the game, that's where you have to go. So weirdly, that might be my favorite accomplishment is allowing us to see home plate so we can write baseball games.
I spent my life in aux boxes. I was always like, the columnist, but I always figured the beat writers needed to be in the press box, and I could write from anywhere. So I was always out in the right field line there somewhere. I'm a harsh critic of everything I've ever written, so I don't like most of it. But I wrote a column, my father's, and I was reminded of this just last month, by the way, the last week of my father's life. And I got a call 54 years later from somebody thanking me for that column. Guy tracked me down. I don't know how, because I've moved like 4 or 5 times since then, to thank me for that column. So that was meaningful to me.
This question is for the panel. In order to succeed in any communication field, one must learn from their mistakes. My question for the panel is, what mistakes do you believe sports journalists make and learn from?
Well, I would say the biggest mistake that journalists make now is the urgency to be first without being right. I always thought be right, be fair, be fast was the order. That unfortunately is not the order that exists anymore, but I'd still like to see be right, be ahead of be first.
I mean, I think you're constantly making mistakes and learning from them just because the workload is so great. But I used to work next to a competitor who, when he logged on, he had a big message on his screen that said, "Check the final score, dummy," because at some point he had the wrong score in the paper, and it was back in the days where it was just in the paper all day and you couldn't go online and fix it. And it always made me laugh. So I try to do similar things if I make little mistakes. But yeah, it's honestly in our line of work with the beat writing, I think a lot of the things that you're learning about are like travel mistakes. I've got a whole list of horror stories of how travel mistakes and things like that. But yeah. With the advent of, a lot of times now we post straight to the internet with nothing getting edited. So I need to give myself maybe a screen that says double check the headline, dummy, because you get something wrong in a headline. Not only is it bad news, but it's in the URL. So it really messes things up.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hi again. I meant to ask, what is your favorite quote? Like, if there's one quote that like really resonates with you, I know Alex mentioned one, but I wasn't able to hear that.
Mine was probably when I was covering Bo Jackson. When he came up, he had a horrible stuttering problem. And we got along and did a lot of stuff. But he finally addressed the stuttering problem. And his quote was, "People thought I was arrogant." So I said, because I always said my name. Bo knows, Bo says something. It's because I couldn't say the word I without stuttering. And that one stuck around for a long time. That people, when they reference Bo Jackson, oh, that's why he always said Bo.
What was the question?
Oh, your favorite quote.
That's my quote. By the
Single
way.
quote?
Yeah. Woo!
I remember, this just comes to mind, it was Steve Kerr was talking about the Bulls after a game, and he had the box score sitting in the locker room. The Bulls had won. And Judd Bushler, who's like the surfer dude from San Diego, this is back during the championship years with Michael Jordan, and he was looking at the box score, and Judd played like 5 minutes, and he had 4 points and 3 rebounds and 2 assists. And Kerr's doing this math, and he said, the problem with this goddamn team, if they just played Judd for 48 minutes, he ended up with 48 points, 24 rebounds, and 32 assists. And it was just hilarious. He came up with that on the spot, and it was like, I don't know. I enjoyed that. That was a good quote.
Do you mean like one like we generated from in like a story, or just like in general?
I would say like for example, the phrase like goodbye zone is something that I resonate, right? It means that keep a positive attitude, whatever it is you do. So it's something that like really inspires you. I don't know, like go on.
Yeah. I covered the Yankees for a season, and there's a famed grizzled baseball writer named George King who works for the New York Post. He's worked there since the dawn of time. And George at spring training he'd get there first every day, and he would watch all the pitchers throw bullpens. And it would be him and one other guy, the guy from Newsday. And so it was my first year, doing the Yankees. I'd done the Mets for 3 years, and so I was I knew to sort of follow George's lead, but I didn't want to sort of encroach on his territory. So I said, hey, is it all right if tomorrow I come and, watch the early bullpens with you? And it's like 7 in the morning in Tampa. It's spring training, which is awful, and you just feel like death the entire time. And we're watching a bullpen, and Phil Hughes, who was like still considered a good pitcher then, comes up lame after he throws a pitch, and he walks out of the pen, and it's myself, George, and Eric Bolin from Newsday, and we're like, hey, what happened? He goes, oh, I think I tore my lat, and whatever. And so we all go run upstairs to write it, and we're going to be ahead of everyone else on the beat. And as we're in the elevator going up, King is like scratching he has this huge beard. He's just like, well, that's why you get there early. So that's always because I think like in what we do, like 85 to 90% is just like showing up on time, like paying attention, like giving a shit. Like, it's all like, if you do those things, like you will be ahead of the game because it's hard to care that much. But if you can put that amount of energy into it, it has rewards.
Well, my favorite quote is one that never got in the paper, but it involves newspapering and how it works. John Denny was a pitcher with the Cardinals, late 70s, early 80s. Very talented, very temperamental. He had a 5-0 lead in Philadelphia one day, 3rd inning. He got tossed out by the umpire for protesting balls and strikes too much, and that cost him a win because the Cardinals won the game easily. After the game, I go in and talk to Ted Simmons, the catcher, and Ted says, John's got the ability to be a 20-game winner if he can just harness that temper of his. And I thought, well, I should probably convey this information to John Denny, who agreed with Ted Simmons and said, he's exactly right. I'm going to work really hard at that. Well, in those days, the Sporting News had one writer from each city be their correspondent for a week, and you'd send your best material to them. So I thought I'd rework that story for the Sporting News. Came out, I was pretty happy with the story. Then they had a picture of John Denny. Underneath was a caption that said, Redbird Redneck. I thought, oh boy, this may not go well for me. And for the next 6 to 8 to 10 starts, John Denny, same thing after the game. I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you. Finally, the season's about over. We're in Pittsburgh in the dugout before the game. I said, John, can you tell me why you're not talking to me? He says, I think you know. I said, well, I have a pretty good idea. Is it about that caption in the Sporting News? Well, yes, it is. I said, well, John, we do not write those captions. We do not write the headlines. Online we do now, but in those days we did not. I said, we just send our stuff in, and this is the way newspapering works. We're the writers. They have editors, and we had a nice half-hour discussion about journalism and how it works. And John says, finally, I'm glad we had this discussion. I learned a lot today, and I'm still not talking to you.
I'll go really quick with mine, but my favorite quote that I've ever gotten was in 2010, Dallas Braden was pitching for the A's, and they played the Yankees, and Alex Rodriguez was on base. Somebody fouls the ball off. He runs from second to third. It's foul ball. He goes from first to third. To go back to first base, he cuts across the pitcher's mound. Dallas Braden, after the game, has a big fit about that. Says it, and he tells A-Rod at the time, like, get off my mound. Says afterwards, blasts him for running across the mound. And A-Rod's response to that was, probably understandably, who the hell is Dallas Braden? 2 weeks later, Dallas Braden throws the 19th perfect game in Major League history. And his sweet little grandmother, who raised him after his mom died, was in the press room afterwards. And I went over and talked to her and said, what'd you think of your grandson throws the 19th perfect game in Major League history. What'd you think? She said, stick it, A-Rod.
That's outstanding.
Yeah. She was great.
I was in the room once when Muhammad Ali said, you want to hear my shortest poem? Yeah? Me. We. We're done. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.